Hello everyone, I'm Craig A. Woodward.
And I'm James A. Moores.
I'm the Idiot, and he's the Bohemian, and even if this is your first time here, welcome back to the Broken Quill. Our topic today is serialization. Defining what we mean by this is important, as there's not really a hard and fast explanation.
A lot of literary concepts are like that.
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit of a trend with us.
Trends in literature.
Well, I've spoken about this to others, and even yourself in the past, James, but I find that everyone has their own small variances in definition. Personally, serialization to me is any series with an overarching primary plot, where more episodes feed the plot than don't. It's a little cut and dry, but it works for me. What about you?
This becomes a problem. Back when Charles Dickens is writing in the Victorian period, we've got a lot of writers writing serials. And what that was is specifically where you write a book and release it chapter by chapter in a magazine. People would wait months and months for the next installment of the adventure. This carried through the serials in the 40s, when Batman and Superman, Flash Gordon, Robin Hood would appear each week in a short 20-minute adventure, a small part of a greater whole. At the time, there were also episodic works that were called serials, like Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, where they were self-contained weekly adventures. We come forward to today, when shows went from being the sort of monster of the week to these singular stories spread out over X many episodes, like the Game of Thrones on HBO. And then the Marvel 22 film Infinity War series, or whatever they're calling it. The idea of a set of works self-contained into a singular thing tend to be a series. So there's no connection between the Discworld books. They're just books set in this one location, but they mix. They're the Discworld series. The same goes for the culture novels by Ian M. Banks. They spend thousands and thousands of years, rarely have the same characters, and cover completely different subject matter, but they are connected by a shared universe. So serialization for the modern era has more to do, I think, with the rise of universe fiction, where over the 20th century we wanted more and more stories set in a singular world, with characters that come together and separate and have a singular cohesive movement over a large number of individual works. That may be confusing and long answer to that.
If our audience can't handle long answers in this show, they're in for a bad time.
Ha! I think they'll be fine.
Hope so, because we've got more of that coming. So, you seem to have a clear definition right down to a fine art. So, why isn't this kind of definition on something like Wikipedia? I looked.
It is on Wikipedia, just more in a historical format and less of a handy-dandy definition you can point to and say, aha, that's the singular definition, ne'er does it stray.
Well, that's terribly inconvenient.
Douglas Adams would approve. Somebody find me the guide.
Well, on that note, I suppose we should say to our listeners, don't panic. There's a lot of ground to cover in terms of serialization, but I think it's important to talk about its opposites as well. By this I mean episodic formats, which, to my limited understanding, involves storytelling that may or may not have an overarching plot, but the general consensus of episodes tip back and forth on their own storylines with little to no continuity needed. A good example of this would be many of the original Trek series, where the majority of episodes were their own little adventures, or based on character building or character antics in general. There were some that enjoyed a few arcs and stories, Voyager, DS9, others of its ilk, but overall they still had more filler episodes than plot-centric episodes, so I'd say they still count.
I'd say I'd agree with the more Victorian style view of things. The opposite of serialization is singular work. There's a difference between the Game of Thrones novel series, the Harry Potter books, or the Red Rising series, than to a singular work like Heart of Darkness, Frankenstein, or Catcher in the Rye. Dickens released Tales of Two Cities in a series, but nobody considers it a serialized work today. We just think of it as a singular novel. Next to nobody interacts with it as a serialized piece of work, but in fact, they do all the time. I've met nobody who has interacted with that tome of a work in one sitting. It's read chapter by chapter. People stop when it suits them. Is serialization something about the work, or the way we interact with it?
Well, by that definition, every book that has chapters or every series that has episodes, regardless of content, is a serialized work. But then you might even take it further. Is the break in a paragraph where the scene changes and a breath can be drawn able to be considered a stopping point enough that you could call the sequence of events a series? How far does it break? How far can you break it down? How far does it go? And is having that level of breakdown even helpful? What is the benefit from not having a categorization specific to the show's content and how that content is handled versus having it and being able to distinguish it?
The technical aspect is rising, middle, fall. Chapters are organized with essentially a beginning, middle, and end. They aren't just placed randomly. There are rules for sentences, paragraphs, chapters, books. But from what you're saying, I think you're right. There needs to be a reason for everything. There is a point where your avant-garde use of chapters breaks down. But I think we can go too far in the other direction as well. As one might ask, what is the benefit from a break every time the reader takes a breath? What is the benefit of having a serial so long it spans decades? Batman and Superman have been having comics that basically tell a single continuous story that spans 70-odd years. And even then, King Arthur and Robin Hood, how do we consider characters who we've been telling stories about for hundreds of years? Is that serialization? I think we need to decide on some ground rules for this, or we're going to be lost in the weeds. And I am really bad out of the rough on the golf course, let alone the sand traps and water hazards.
And I suppose that's why there are different clubs. You need different words, different assignments for different contexts that resonate with people in an easy-to-grasp way. The rabbit hole only exists if we allow it to open and dive into it by looking at history rather than colloquial use. So if I were to ask a layman what serialization was, they'd probably quote the MCU, they'd probably quote a series like The Expanse, Game of Thrones, New Trek, etc. And if I asked them about episodic, they'd pull out classic Trek, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Goosebumps, or even Discworld if we're talking literature. And isn't that basic definition, as inaccurate as it might be to the overall histories of the etymology, able to be significantly more useful to us than diving into the depths of its past that we end up missing the forest for the trees?
That's my line.
I'm well aware it's called a cruel irony, like how unintelligent I look next to you. And yes, I'm stealing that one from Yzma.
I think you are no less intelligent next to me than I, a horse next to a llama.
Considering how intelligent llamas are, I don't think your words are as comforting as you think they are.
Well, since you're the llama, very?
I think everybody knows who the llama is. Continue on.
Your wish is my command, Prince Mushkin. But you have the right of it, so let's agree. For our purpose here, serialization will be defined by works released with clear breaks, sequels, or episodes, yet still retain a singular threaded plotline. An episodic will be Monster of the Week format, where each book, show, or movie is not a singular threaded story. But hang on. What would you say about Star Trek Voyager? It's a singular story of let's go home. It's thin, perhaps, but it exists. The fact that each episode barely mentions that plan, isn't that still a singular plot thread? Is not the concept of the fugitive trying to find the one-armed man and just getting into random stuff during his flight a singular thread? The Hulk running from the military in the old Hulk TV series? And what about universe fiction? I said in my last essay about Star Trek Picard that lots of people tend to complain that Picard isn't true to Star Trek The Next Generation. Is that not a complaint towards serialization? That this thing, which followed this other thing, isn't properly fitting into the series? I think I'm slicing for the water hazard now.
I think so too, because I don't consider those plots in the slightest. They're platforms. A superhero is a hero that is super in some way. He saves people and he wins the day. Is that considered a storyline? Buffy the Vampire Slayer is considered the perfect textbook definition of Monster of the Week serialization, but she has a plot of her being the Slayer, facing monsters, growing from her encounters and getting stronger. I don't feel going home is a plot because it's not a story, it's an end goal. The story is what happens in between, and those do not connect nor add or often benefit or sometimes even barely mention said end goal. I think we need to establish that the concept of plot is not the same as a show's or book's platform.
Most people consider the Canterbury Tales unfinished because they don't actually get to Canterbury. I think you're mixing characterization with elements of plot. Plot is what happens, yes, and famously, Seinfeld, the show with no plot, I've always contended has a lot of plot. Plot is what's happening, why we're doing this thing. Star Trek Voyager would not be Star Trek Voyager without the journey home. Just because we might think the plot is mundane doesn't mean it's not still plot. Ulysses by James Joyce is just a story about a guy going about a day, and the Odyssey by Homer are about things that happen to people on their way home from a war. Yes, plot is the main sequence of events that happen, but the connecting thread is important. I think reducing this to simply a platform, as in an element of setting, is reductive to the importance of why we're here. Telling Pliskin there's a bomb in his neck so he better save the president's daughter is just as important to what is going on as his fighting with gangs and playing basketball. Yes, that's part of the movie. Driving action is still plot. Though that being said, for the purposes here, I think I can concede, for your definition, the concept of direct action towards and not minor action towards. Say, for instance, the fact that in Babylon 5, the last 5 minutes of every episode was dedicated to the main plot of that series. It does not get it out of the other 40 minutes being dedicated to random things that have nothing to do with anything. Star Trek Deep Space Nine mentioned the Dominion in many early episodes, but they aren't really a major connection to the main action that will take place later in the Dominion War. A show going from more episodic to more serialized. How's that?
Almost satisfied, I'd say.
Half happy?
Perhaps. I feel that a summarization isn't plot, though. For example, it is a summarization that Voyager is trying to get home. A few episodes here and there are about them finding new ways, and yes, they're always moving, but the overall summarization on a Netflix description is not the plot, I'd say. Plot is the story, after all, exactly what you said, what is happening now. So the plot of Voyager is, in fact, they find Seven of Nine and they try to rehabilitate her by removing her implants. That's plot. The plot of those episodes. Does the journey home have any weight at all on that decision or development? A character comes out of the blue. Her entire arc as a character, everything of who she is and who she becomes, is entirely unaffected by this so-called plot. Which means it's not really a plot at all. I stand by the term platform, even if you disagree.
I super disagree with that, so I guess we're gonna have to do an episode on plot then.
Probably a good idea, before we digress too much, but it does inform serialization and allow us to have a strict definition of how to categorize things. And let's face it, media is one of the hardest things to categorize. All forms of art are. If it's something from the mind and heart and artistic expression of an individual or collective group, it's difficult to assign it to a category shared by other things. I'm quite happy that serialization and episodic actually meet those needs rather tidily, compared to some more nebulous concepts like that of horror versus gothic in literature. There's a Pandora's box.
That's another episode there, I think. Are we keeping track of this?
And probably should be. Continue?
Okay, good. I don't want us to lose track of this. Wait, is this serialized or episodic?
Episodic, definitely.
Serialized then, got it.
Both?
We haven't really come to any conclusions, have we?
Yeah, probably not.
So then let's bring it back,
Alright.
as you suggest, to something useful. So what's the point of all this? Why do Monster of the Week and why do Singular Story spread out over multiple episodes? If you write a giant book, and it's obviously a giant book, and then spread it out, people will notice that. They'll see it. People do know when you're doing Monster of the Week and when you're doing Cut Up Book. Sometimes people love it, sometimes people hate it, but that doesn't really matter, does it? I think what we're really talking about is in the bounds of episodic in this basic definition and serialized in this basic definition. It's about the story you want to tell and how you want to tell it. If you have a singular big story, then yeah, split it into multiple parts, and those parts will be like chapters, trilogies, or 9-book series. And if you're doing that, then you're doing serialized. If you just want to do a series of short stories, mystery books, or space operas with the same characters going on weekly adventures, then you're doing episodic. When people talk about series and they talk about universe fiction, they're actually talking about something else and not serialization. Star Trek Picard doesn't have to be like Star Trek The Next Generation because they're not really part of the same series. They are part of the same universe, and whether they fit properly or not into universe fiction is actually a good topic for another day. Wouldn't you agree with that, Dostoevsky?
I think I can agree on those terms, though our bouncing around might have been interesting at least. And if it was, join the discussion below with a comment. Also, remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and if you have anything you'd like to hear us talk about, please let us know down there. And we'll see you all next time on The Broken Quill. Are you ever going to stop calling me Dostoevsky or Mushkin?
You're going to stop denigrating yourself?
The day you stop being smarter than me.
I'm not so apt.